His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. We are returning to a favorite topic of the podcast today. It's hard to believe that it's been 8 years since the debut of Turn Washington Spies on the AMC network, those glorious 4 seasons when practically the whole country was learning to pronounce Setauket and talking about a somewhat fictionalized version of what was happening on Long Island during the Revolutionary War. Today we are going back for another look, talking about some people that you don't usually hear about, expanding the circle, digging deeper, all while sitting in an 18th century cottage with today's very special guest.
I'm Mark Sternberg. I'm the Culper Spy Ring Historian for the Drowned Meadow Cottage Museum here in downtown Port Jefferson, New York.
And Mark, I think I wrote to you that you have my new favorite title of anyone in the cultural heritage profession, Culper Spy Ring Historian.
Yeah, I absolutely love it, and I absolutely love the Culper Spy Ring. I've been heavily invested in it for almost a decade now. So
one thing, we've been talking, and we'll talk about where we are and the topic, but just in terms of the Culper Spy Ring story in general, this is my metaphor as you've been telling me everything you've discovered. It's sort of like invisible ink that keeps revealing more things about this story as people dig deeper and look at it. How did you first become aware of the story, and what fascinates you about it?
So it's actually a funny story. Back in 2013, I was in a producing program at NYU, and the teacher said, I want you to come up with a pitch for a new television show. And I was like, well, I want to make a television show about Port Jeff. And I was reading Rob Sisler, actually the same gentleman that saved this house. I was reading his book, 7 Hills of Port Jefferson. And he mentioned that Phillips and Nathaniel Roe were part of Washington's Culper Spy Ring. So I dug into that a little bit more, tried to find the original source for that. And when I talked to a lot of local historians, they said, oh, we're not sure that that's true. We never really found a basis for that. We think it may just be legend. But the way that it was written in the original source that Rob Sisler mentioned, a book called Peculiar Service by Corey Ford, it seemed a little bit too specific. And I was like, this seems like it's a transcription. So I dug for a couple of months, and I found the source that it was based on. It was based off of a letter from Nehemiah Marks, a loyalist, and it was being sent to Oliver Delancey. And the letter itself mentioned that Phillips and Nathaniel Roe were in league with Caleb Brewster, the whaleboat courier for the Culper Spy Ring, and that they were giving him intelligence. And the letter itself is housed in Clements Library in Michigan as part of the University of Michigan. And yeah, so it was a big, we call it the Letter of Significance now. We have a reproduction here. But during that period, which was very funny, one of my friends who knew I was investigating this also sent me an email, and he's like, you're not going to believe this. And I was like, what? He's like, they're actually making a TV show about the Culper Spy Ring. So I was like, this is incredibly obscure. I barely even knew the story when I was a kid. But yeah, then Turn came out, and everything else is history.
If you just got into that pitch meeting earlier, you could have been the...
Well, that was what was so interesting is my teacher, I go back to her and I say, you're not going to believe this. They're actually already making a show about what I'm trying to write about. And she said, well, that's a good sign. You were onto something interesting. And she's like, let me ask you a question. Was this that petticoat thing? And I was like, what are you talking about? And she said to me, she's like, you're not going to believe this. Yeah, she's like, when I think she formerly worked, maybe it was at Disney. She said a lot of people were trying to make stories about, specifically focused on Anna Nancy Strong, and, the petticoats and everything. And she said, yeah, it's probably pencils down for a lot of producers across the country who were, interested in specifically that part of the story.
So all the... Revolutionary War era Long Island projects. People were damned. They beat us to it. So let's just back up a second. So are you from this area?
Yeah, I can actually see the hill that I grew up on from here. I'm from Port Jefferson, class of 2001. I moved to New York City. I was living there. But with COVID, I ended up moving back out here. I currently live in East Patchogue, but my parents still live in my childhood home here. So when I came back to Long Island with COVID, or not with the disease or illness, but because of COVID, yeah, I ended up getting back involved with the cottage and the museum here.
Okay, so you mentioned the cottage, and I'm looking out the window too. So tell us or explain where we are.
So we are in downtown Port Jefferson, New York. Originally, it would have been called Drowned Meadow. It was called Drowned Meadow because it flooded twice a day with the tides. And that's what it would have been called until, I believe it's 1836, when they changed the name to honor our third president, Thomas Jefferson, and it became Port Jefferson. But we named this the Drowned Meadow Cottage Museum not only because it was the period we're focusing on was for Phillips Roe and the time he lived in it. It would have been called Drowned Meadow, but also because it may be the last thing in this town named Drowned Meadow. So it keeps the old name alive for, the original name for the village.
What's the organization running the cottage, or how should we explain it?
The village of Port Jefferson is the head of this cottage. We are running independently of other organizations in Port Jeff, but obviously we're running alongside key organizations that are providing us assistance here in the historical community within Port Jeff.
So Phillips Roe. So we're in his cottage or his house. You want to explain some of the history of the building itself?
Sure. So this building, currently we're on the corner of West Broadway and Barnum in downtown Port Jefferson. But this house would have originally been on Main Street, sort of across from Theater 3, if people know the Port Jefferson area. It was moved originally in 1867 across the street, sort of near where, if people remember, where Cappy's Carpet used to be. Now I believe it's a Southdown Coffee. And then from there, it was moved to a holding site sort of near our village center. And then from there, in early 2000, it was moved to its current site, which we're on right now.
And so it dates to?
It dates to 1755 initially. And sort of we knew it survived because of newspaper articles, and it sort of went into hiding for a while. And it was really Rob Sisler, Dr. Rob Sisler, who, through connections in the village and in one of his talks with a local resident who lived in the house, realized this was Phillips Roe's house, the house from the 1700s that had gone missing, because we have a lot of local lore says specifically that there were only 5 houses in Drowned Meadow before 1800. And we knew what happened to each of the others, but this one sort of went unidentified for many years. But through a lot of architectural research and everything like that, and looking at the original location it was based on, we came to the conclusion this is the house, and it's exactly as the local lore and family lore had described.
And one thing I learned talking to you earlier was when we talk about the Revolutionary time or 1700s, and we say Setauket, we have to broaden what we think of as Setauket. Right,
and that's a really good point. It's an interesting thing when you go through these letters from the 1700s and people say, Drowned Meadow in Setauket. Setauket was sort of synonymous with Brookhaven, and more likely it was like synonymous with northern Brookhaven. So if you ever visit Brookhaven Town Hall, definitely take a look to your right as you walk in, and you'll see the original deed for Setauket. And it includes from, basically Stony Brook all the way out to Mount Sinai. Then it would have been called Old Man's. And you can see that this original property of Setauket was much larger than the hamlet that we consider Setauket today.
And we'll get into the Culper Spy Ring, because now when we think of activity happening in Setauket, it really encompasses Setauket, Drowned Meadow, Mount Sinai. So this will all pull together a lot of things. So tell us who Phillips Roe was, and then let's start getting into the Culper Spy Ring, or actually spying connections, because it kind of predates the Culper Spy Ring.
So it's an interesting thing. Like, a lot of people think, the Culper Spy Ring started after the loss of the Battle of Long Island in 1776. That Abraham Woodhull looked at what happened to his first cousin once removed, Nathaniel Woodhull, and said, I'm going to be a patriot. It's like, no, these people are all pretty active in their patriotism after the war started, but in 1775, but before the battle itself had come to Long Island in the fall of 1776, summer of 1776. And yeah, you can see that Phillips Roe, his brother Nathaniel Roe Jr., Abraham Woodhull, Selah Strong, these, for those of you that know the Culper Spy Ring, these are names that you'll recognize. They were all part of this committee of safety, hunting out local loyalists. It was basically a shadow government that replaced the British-controlled government. And so they were all patriotic from the word go. They were all, actively doing their part. Phillips Roe became an adjutant under Brigadier General Nathaniel Woodhull. Adjutant is basically somebody that sort of delegates orders for their commanding officer. And, you know, a lot of your listeners will probably be familiar with the name Nathaniel Woodhull. But for those that aren't, there's a tragic story that he was trying to surrender after the loss of the Battle of Long Island. He gets swamped by the British. And Oliver Delancey Jr. and his men end up, you know, either Oliver Delancey was involved or not, but they end up cutting up Nathaniel Woodhull as he's trying to surrender. And a few weeks later, Nathaniel Woodhull would die of his wounds. Just to put it in context, you know, he was... If you look at New York as a country, because colonies basically were countries, he was basically the president at one point of this country. So until he, you know, resigned to become a brigadier general of the Long Island militia as a whole. So it's an interesting thing that, like, here's one of the most important people in the country of New York, if you see New York as a country, and, you know, he dies in this martyr sacrifice, you know, to the nation. And obviously that probably weighed a lot on Phillips Roe and decisions he made, and affected his temperament going forward.
So pre-Battle of Long Island, in a sense, tell me if you don't agree with any of this. So these people on the Committee of Safety, all these people were seeing the future or hoping the future was a new country. And so they sort of had the upper hand until, I guess, the British forces really came and change their perspective.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like, you know, I think you can see the temperament. There's mild writings and, you know, people that are describing the Long Island militia, that they were high-spirited, that they were into this, they were excited. And then when they found out that they lost the Battle of Long Island, all of them were in a panic. They were starting to flee. Literally, it was only Phillips Roe and a handful of people that were trying to hold this militia together after that traumatic loss. But yeah, people were looking to, you know, you have to go back and think, okay, July 4th, 1776, you know, you have the Declaration of Independence, and then by July 9th, it's being read here. So, you know, we're already after the Declaration of Independence. People were looking towards having a new country, and then you have this devastating defeat at the Battle of Long Island, Battle of Brooklyn, and thousands of Americans get captured and, or, you know, die. But for the people out in Brookhaven, news doesn't travel fast. And for a lot of them, they thought they were going to be heading out west to Brooklyn to join the American companies. And instead, they were surprised when they got to Huntington or Dix Hills that the Americans had already lost. So you'll see after that, a lot of Americans flee to Connecticut and the mainland. You know, it's a book called Mather's Refugees that actually captures all of the people that fled Long Island during that time because they didn't want to be under the occupation of the British.
Yeah, and so, you know, the analogy of a country, so New York becomes an occupied country. The British are occupying the city. It was their main headquarters, but the island becomes their breadbasket and things like that. So you've got this layer of society out here in Setauket, these families who had been on the losing side now. So what does Setauket become in terms of loyalties, and how does it operate, and how do these people survive in the new world?
Well, it's interesting because you can actually see in modern day Setauket, you know, you have the Caroline Church, and that was an Anglican church. It's one of the oldest in the nation. And so there were very divided loyalties even initially. You know, you had Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Floyd, Dr. George Murison. These are all names of prominent loyalists that, you know, obviously were supporting the British cause. And it's interesting, too, because, you know, there's a lot of ways to describe the American Revolution. And one of those ways is there's a battle between Anglicans and Presbyterians. And that's definitely the way you could describe it in Setauket, because a lot of the people that are part of the Culper Spy Ring were Presbyterians. Selah Strong was a prominent Presbyterian, Abraham Woodhull, Phillips Roe, Nathaniel Roe. Even Caleb Brewster was the grandson of Nathaniel Brewster. So, you know, they come from a long line of Presbyterians. So it's, you know, to the extent that people wanted the freedom to practice, and then the British also added insult to injury, right? They turned all of the Presbyterian churches and other religions, for that matter, Quaker meeting houses, for example, into stables or houses for soldiers and stuff, and they prohibited Presbyterians from practicing. And then they also even harassed some Presbyterian ministers, Ebenezer Prime in Huntington being a prominent example.
So why don't we talk about, you mentioned Selah Strong, and I know we want to get to recent research that you've published. So situate the Strong family and Selah specifically in this time.
Yeah, so there's a big misconception that pervades that, you know, Selah Strong and his wife, Anna Nancy Strong, Nancy being her nickname, were living in modern-day Setauket in the area known as Strong's Neck. And it turns out when you actually dig back into the records that you look in, you know, if you read Kate Strong's articles, Kate W. Strong, her articles, they're part of what are called True Tales. you'll see that the Strongs didn't actually even own that property at the earliest possible September 1783, but likely they owned it after the war. The war ended officially in November 1783. So, they're not even living there until either the extreme end of the war or after the war. So they were actually living in their original property, which was on what we call Mount Misery Neck. And that that's basically a peninsula here in the Port Jefferson area that comprises both the village of Belterre and also the area of Port Jeff known as Harbor Hills. So, to the extent that Caleb Brewster was coming here, he was landing on that property. His goal was to get to that property specifically. So he would be, hiding out there with his whaleboat men on Selah Strong's property, basically that peninsula of, because the Strongs owned all of that property. Eventually they would name it Oakwood, the Strong family descendants. But it was called Mount Misery Neck when Selah and Anna were living there. I definitely recommend people check out my article, Selah Strong, Records Reveal an Overlooked Hero of the Culper Spy Ring. But towards the end of that article, I found a pension from one of Caleb Brewster's whaleboat men that goes into detail, like extreme amount of detail, about the way that Caleb Brewster and his whaleboat men operated, and that, they were landing on Selah Strong's property. He calls it Old Man's. For those that aren't familiar, that's Mount Sinai. And it was because Selah Strong's house, we know where the house was, it sort of was situated closer to Mount Sinai Harbor than it was to Port Jefferson Harbor. But again, it's on the eastern side of that peninsula, Mount Misery. And it's very interesting because it's, Selah Strong was clearly a part of the Culper Spy Ring through the entire thing. The whaleboat men, his name is Robert Brush, he goes into detail about how Selah Strong would even help them escape or warn them when the British were coming on the property.
So the popular perception of Culper Spy Ring, the names that come up, we probably won't even mention Townsend after this, but Abraham Woodhull sort of is portrayed as running the spy ring. Talmadge in Connecticut is sort of above him, but in terms of on the ground in Long Island, you hear about Woodhull, Culper Sr. doing a lot of it. But to get to your research and to fill in some of these gaps or these pictures, Selah Strong was really working before then even, but then also was in Setauket at the same time doing a lot of work with them.
Yeah, it turns out that Selah wasn't in prison for a very long period of time, less than 6 months, or 7 months, and that he was free by the time this, a lot of historians believe that the Culper Spy Ring started in the fall of 1778, or summer or fall. And so he was there the entire time, and he never actually fled to Connecticut. That, again, in my article, I show where that sort of myth came from, but he never left to go to Connecticut. He stayed here the entire time. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing. It's like, we can sit and try and figure out who was the head of the spy ring, but it's clear that Selah Strong, if nothing else, was the fall guy, that the spy ring was operating under General Parsons before it was operating under Washington. You can kind of see that in some of the letters that Washington writes, where he's like, oh, I've looked at Parsons' intelligence that you gave him, and, he refers to that. It was Washington's thing, right? He always wanted information as quickly as possible. So for him to cut out the middleman, well, that would just save time. And that seems to be what happened, is that, the spy ring was operating for other generals before Washington, but it sort of graduated because of its quality and, its efficiency to eventually go under Washington itself. But Selah Strong, to his credit, was the only one that, we know that other spies were involved before that, but Selah Strong was the one that really took the blame for all of them and ends up in the provost, not a sugar house, not the Jersey, the provost under the horrible, horrible Provost Marshal William Cunningham, who is notorious towards all of his prisoners.
Selah Strong, so we're talking before Talmadge being in charge of spying and Woodhull. So what was Selah Strong doing that got him in, you say, calling him the fall guy? So what was the situation that got him in that position?
There's a really good letter from Richard Hewlett. It's funny when you watch Turn and they make up these.
I see the characters.
Yeah. What do they call? He's not Richard though, because they gave him a different name.
Well, and they made him British.
Yeah, and they made him British too. He was a loyalist. I think he was from Queens. But yeah, it's funny because you see the character, but Richard Hewlett, which is his real name, I forgot what they called him initially in the show. Probably because there was Richard Woodhull, so they didn't want to get the two confused. They changed the first name. But anyway, it's Richard Hewlett, and he writes this angry letter to Tryon after the Battle of Setauket in the summer of 1777, where General Parsons has this sort of failed attack on the fort in Setauket. Modern day Setauket. It was the fort was a redoubt on the village green, and he writes this. Richard Hewlett writes this angry letter to Tryon saying, these people are acting like they were our friends, and here, he describes all of these people betraying, the loyalists that they were acting like they were friends with during the Battle of Setauket. Like Samuel Thompson was, saying that the British are going to lose and stuff like that. It's a very interesting article to read, and it identifies a lot of people. But when it comes to Selah Strong being mentioned in that letter, Hewlett mentioned specifically that Selah Strong was dealing with Parsons and that he was giving the information to
Is that the ferry coming
That's
in?
the ferry in the background, yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, he was he was giving information to a John and Cornelius Clark to give to Parsons. And Selah Strong would... It's still a ferry.
Some local color.
Yeah. And Selah Strong would warn the loyalists in Setauket that the John Clark and Cornelius Clark had arrived, but he would always do it intentionally late after they had already left. So it wasn't, because again, you got to, for those that aren't entirely familiar with this area, the fort was in modern day Setauket, and then Selah's on Mount Misery, so that's about 3 miles. So, for him to go, warn them, come back, it's, obviously those people had already shipped off by the time Hewlett and his men were given that information that these people were there. So Hewlett pieced it all together, and in a couple of months, Selah Strong would be sent to the provost for treasonable correspondence with the enemy, which is basically like the civilian version of the crime of spying.
And like we were alluding, so in sort of the written or the histories that get told, Selah sort of fades from the story at that point. He gets in jail, and then he does he ever go to Connecticut? Because that's the other story, that he flees to Connecticut.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
And that's what's interesting, is that whole piece of the myth came alive because Henry Onderdonk wrote this book, Revolutionary Incidents in Suffolk and Kings Counties, and he mistranscribed the document. It was a request for these patriots from that are in Connecticut. They were requesting permission to come back to Long Island, and their names were Mrs. Shelton, and if you read the document properly, Mrs. Strong. And they were asking for permission via Benjamin Talmadge, and they were asking permission from Connecticut Governor Trumbull to come back to Brookhaven to visit their parents.
During the war.
During the war itself, yeah. And what's interesting is, Onderdonk mistranscribed it as Mr. Strong. And then Mather, Frederick Gregory Mather, when he writes Mather's Refugees in 1776, he basically embellishes that story and says, oh, this is Mrs. Shelton and Mr. Strong. It must be Selah Strong's sister who married a Shelton, and then Selah Strong himself, because of the relationship. And then from there, it got embellished that, Selah Strong was never here. In a lot of these local histories, he was either in prison or he was in Connecticut, but he was never part of the Culper Spy Ring just because time wouldn't allow it. He was like, the minute he escaped the provost, he immediately fled to Connecticut.
Right, which if you spin that out, then the implication, Nancy was running the household by herself, maybe, and it kind of changes her story a little. So to stick on the documents, and we'll mention your article is up on New York Archives magazine.
Yeah, it's New York Archives magazine. It'll be in their fall issue. I believe it'll be it should be out this in the month of October. If you follow us on our Instagram at DMC_museum, you'll be able to see a link to that article and be able to check it out.
So we did a walk through the cottage here. A lot of the documentation and exhibits you've got just highlight how there's so much more detail in the records than make it into some of the more commonly known sources. So, and I'm thinking of the evidence of Caleb Brewster and bring it back to the Roes, like his interaction with the Roe House. And so do you want to just say a little bit more about the other evidence of the activities of the Culper Spy Ring beyond Woodhull and Townsend and the usual names?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? It's there's that letter of significance I found that sort of ties the Roes initially to the spy ring, but then when you go into the incidents of plundering, which is these privateers, basically Congress didn't have a navy, so they would give these letters of marque and reprisal to merchants to become basically legalized pirates, and these people were plundering ships at sea. But when they got these letters of marque from the Connecticut governor Trumbull, they allowed people to also go on land and plunder. So people in, North Shore of Long Island in particular, were waking up in the middle of the night with these pirates in their house, ransacking the place. And the Roes in particular got a huge brunt of it. They're portraying themselves as loyalists as part of the Culper Spy Ring, but they're secretly patriots. And what's interesting is, they get plundered. Both Phillips Roe and then his brother Nathaniel Roe both get plundered twice. And in total, there's 3 plundering incidents in total. So, for here, we talk a lot about these privateers and these incidents. And we even had a reenactor. We even had pirate reenactors play privateers for a day and talk about plundering the Roe House in 1781. And what's interesting is when the Roes get plundered, well, you can actually get your stuff back if because once these individuals get plundered, it has to go through a court process, a maritime court, and you have to fight these libels against the things that were taken from you. And the Roes actually utilized Caleb Brewster to carry the argument for them. And Caleb Brewster, one of the things that's really cool is he talks about the patriotism of the Roes. In fact, he goes into an extreme detail about the Roes and their patriotism. For Nathaniel Roe Jr., who, again, is Phillips Roe's brother, he mentions specifically that Nathaniel Roe Jr. is held in high esteem by all the Sons of Liberty. First off, that's really cool because I don't know if people know the varying levels of patriotism, but Sons of Liberty were like the most hardcore patriots you're ever going to find. Caleb Brewster also mentions that Nathaniel Roe Jr. hid Caleb Brewster himself and some other soldiers in his basement when Caleb Brewster was aboard the Schuyler. The Schuyler was a ship that gets intercepted by the HMS Falcon and ends up crashing on Cedar Beach in Mount Sinai. But Caleb Brewster and these men managed to escape the British, who were taking everyone that was aboard that ship, and they escaped by hiding in Nathaniel Roe Jr.'s basement. And this is back in November of 1777. So again, we're talking, that the spy ring clearly started before, common portrayals. But it's also awesome just to see that Nathaniel Roe Jr. was basically saved Caleb Brewster, one of the key parts of Washington's Culper Spy Ring, by hiding him in a basement. So
yeah, and the whole theater of war, almost the plundering and the whaleboat wars and things. It's fascinating. So in terms of Connecticut was the rebels' stronghold, pretty much. Why do you think they gave such free rein? Because Long Island would hopefully be part of America at some point. So, what do you think was driving, or did they feel bad that they might be ransacking people that they're hoping to win over again?
Well, at first, I think it was this opinion that if we take stuff from Long Island, the British won't have
They'll
it.
suffer.
And I mean, people question how important it was for even going back to the Battle of Long Island. That during the Battle of Long Island, Nathaniel Woodhull is literally just moving cattle from Queens eastward. And it's like, well, if you can't feed your army, if you can't supply goods for your army, then your army's not going to survive. And so there was this element of, okay, we can take goods from the British that are on shore on Long Island, and then they'll be deprived of them. What ended up happening, and this was a surprise to everyone, is that they were plundering people's houses. So, it's a different context when you're banging down somebody's door in the middle of the night versus, raiding, maybe a small British camp or something like that.
And they would kidnap people, right? They would do ransoms.
Right. And that was also an issue. They were kidnapping people. They kidnapped Colonel Benjamin Floyd. They kidnapped George Morrison. There was a variety of people that they kidnapped. A lot of them for the purposes of exchanging, because that was an issue too, is that if the British had an American who was of equal rank or whatever, if you could find somebody of equal rank and capture them, you could exchange them to get your own man back. Mm-hmm. And it was specifically a weird situation when you had citizens. I definitely recommend people check out the film Mary Silliman's War. But one of the odd things is when you're just a normal citizen and you're captured, well, how do you get that person back? You have to capture another normal citizen to exchange them. So it was an interesting time during the war, and it's very complex. There's so many elements to it.
Well, yeah, and I think, just in terms of people learning history, Long Island really was put through the ringer. We were occupied, but, if you were loyalist, the occupying British didn't really like you and were taking things without paying for them. And if you were trying to support the rebellion, you were possibly being killed, but you were getting it from all sides. The raiders were coming, and then the British were not particularly helping you necessarily. So it's a lot of trauma in Long Island history.
No, it's crazy. And again, George Stout's book's great. I think Natalie Naylor has a book as well, talking about the women's circumstances out here. But I think it's just an incredible situation where it was just relentless. And, it's funny to me when my wife and I traveled the country, like going to different museums and hearing about the revolution in different parts of the country. But it's so fascinating to come back to Long Island and realize, these other parts of the country may have had one large battle, and that was it. But here on Long Island, we had smaller battles, but it was day-to-day, it was endless, and there was small skirmishes where people would get killed constantly. And it was just a relentless series of events that never stopped. It wasn't just like one day in history. It was throughout, from the period Long Island was occupied till the very end of the war in 1783.
And just maybe to get at that, that kind of emotional or psychological terror they had to live under, or the game they had to play. If you stayed on Long Island, you were occupied, but if you were hoping that the British would leave eventually, you had to survive until that point, and yet not be accused of being a British loyalist. Do you want to talk about I'm leading up to the chimney story. Do you want to talk a little bit about the chimney here in the Roe cottage?
So, there's been a lot of discoveries related to the Roes specifically. And again, just to, give people a context of this family tree, Phillips Roe we're talking about, Nathaniel Roe Jr. we're talking about, they're the cousins of Austin Roe, the courier, the on-land courier, at least for the Culper Spy Ring. And also, we found evidence that John Roe Jr., Austin Roe's brother, was also helping with the spy ring. And then, even Austin Roe's other brother, Daniel Roe, is very famous as Captain Daniel Roe. He was involved in some military exploits during the Revolution. But the things that we have discovered ourselves while, researching the Roes, one of the interesting events for this house specifically is when this cottage, was moved in 1867, the chimney was taken apart. And when the workers took the chimney apart, they realized there were documents from the Revolutionary War hidden in the chimney. It made a couple of local newspaper articles. It was a curiosity at the time, and nobody could understand why were there Revolutionary War documents hidden in a chimney. Well, fast forward, almost 150 years to now, and we look at these documents and we say, oh, we know why these documents were there. The Roes were part of Washington's Culper Spy Ring, and these documents are directly related to it. One was a proclamation from General Parsons, and as we've already mentioned, the Spy Ring was working for General Parsons earlier on. And General Parsons made this proclamation. We don't know how much it was distributed because there's only one surviving copy in the entire world as far as we can tell. But what that proclamation said was, it was a letter to Long Islanders, and it said to them, hey, it was basically implying that we knew that you had been forced to take this thing called the Oath of Allegiance, where you had to submit to the King of England. But we know that you've been forced to submit, but don't worry, we won't consider you loyalists unless you actively help the British. So the Roes sort of kept the copy of this proclamation hidden in their chimney because it was basically a get out of jail free card, right? Assuming the Americans won the Revolution and their loyalty was ever questioned, they could show this document and say, hey, we were just doing what we were told. We shouldn't be considered loyalists. And it's an interesting thing, even comparing it to modern day, because there are organizations now that are stripping away the patriotic acts of some of the people on Long Island if they were forced to sign the Oath of Allegiance later and said, hey, you signed this. If your last act was signing an Oath of Allegiance, even if you fought in earlier battles like the Battle of Long Island, we're not going to consider you a patriot. And it's really unfortunate because, the Governor Tryon, the loyalist governor of New York, came through Long Island and forced all men of 16 and older to sign this Oath of Allegiance. And put yourself in their shoes. Are you really going to say no? It's one of those things where, you have to sort of think about it in context.
And with this, I constantly also think of it puts more of a spotlight on post-war President Washington's tour of Long Island in 1790 as a PR move almost, as among other things. But coming out to Long Island, hitting all these spots, he came through Setauket and stayed at the Rose Tavern, and so sort of acknowledging, hey, these were good people, or at least a public show of Long Island is now part of definitely something to bring back into the country.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting when you look at we focus here a lot on, him stopping at Austin Rose Tavern. He also stopped at the Widow Blindenberg's. So it's an interesting thing, like when you sort of take a hard look at every single place that he stopped and say, oh, what do we know about these people, and what were their stances during the Revolutionary War, and maybe we have to reconsider it, because the Widow Blindenberg, I know that the British were or the loyalist companies were stationed on her property quite often. So it's again, it's one of those things where maybe we should reconsider her perspective of the war. And also going back to Blindenberg, she's specifically mentioned by Caleb Brewster as somebody that was plundered. Now, he would only bring up her name if she was plundered unduly and was actually a patriot. So again, it's one of those things where we have to sort of take all of the documents that we can find into account to sort of reassess, who these people were and what role they played in the Revolution.
Now, just to pivot a little bit, to talk again about the Drowned Meadow Cottage, what do you want to say about the operations of the cottage or your plans? Yeah.
So we're working towards being open consistently. We're looking to be open every Saturday and Sunday. But for the time being, definitely follow us on our Instagram at DMC_museum. You can also shoot us an email at dmcottagemuseum@gmail.com. to also get on our email list, and we can also let you know that way about our upcoming openings. If nothing else, we'll definitely be a big part of Port Jefferson's Dickens Festival. We want to be open. We'll be serving apple cider because that's period appropriate. But everyone loves apple cider. But so we're excited to be part of the Port Jeff historical community, and the passion we've already received has been so amazing. It's so funny when we have the lights on in here. There are people that are just walking by on the street, banging on the door to come in, and maybe we'll give them an impromptu tour or whatever. But it's just been the passion for it, the passion for the Culper Spy Ring in general has just been so amazing and such a great thing to see.
So if you were to pitch a Long Island Revolutionary-based show now, how would you change your pitch? Or
oh man, I dream about that every day. It's tough. I would definitely go the Game of Thrones route. I would definitely have I would need at least 8 seasons. I would need there's so many characters in the revolutionary history of Long Island that just don't get mentioned and are so utterly fascinating. Like here we start to bring up the story of George Smith. He joins the Culper Spy Ring in 1781 as SG, but he's so fascinating, right? He graduates Princeton as an attorney, which is rare for the time. And he goes to school for law. It's rare. And, he becomes a prominent attorney out here in Long Island. But, you flash forward, he's in the military. He's going house to house getting people to sign the Patriots Association. And flash forward again, he's, plundering the house of Benjamin Floyd as basically a privateer. And then, you flash forward again, and he's running his own spy ring under Horatio Gates. Flash forward again, and then he's part of the Culper Spy Ring, sending in incredibly important information to Washington. And especially for him, I hope Smithtown joins us in Culper Spy Day in the upcoming years to celebrate George Smith. He's from Nissaquag initially. He's the great grandson of Richard Bullsmith. But each of these people involved, we focus on 6 or so of them, but there's so many people that were key players of the Culper Spy Ring. And, that's one of the things that I say to everyone is I was like, look, this information is no longer hidden. You can go and read it for yourself. Google Founders Online, just type in, once you're on Founders Online, type in Culper, and you can see every letter that mentions Culper, whether it's a Culper letter itself or George Washington is talking about the Culpers. And it's invaluable to be able to just read this stuff for yourself. And it changes the context, right? Because I don't know. I mean, I read these things again and I'm like, oh, this is how did they get that previous interpretation when it clearly says something different in this letter? And, for the extent that the Culper letters aren't on Founders Online, you can also find the rest of them at the Library of Congress website. Yeah, and we've touched on it, or you've alluded to a bunch of these, but just the depth you can find in pension records or in the court cases, these stray mentions that could add something important to the story can turn up somewhere that no one has looked yet. So it's great that you're out there digging still. Yeah, I mean, that would be a long-term goal for our museum, is to have some sort of archive process where we just sort of say, hey, here is every primary source related to the Culper Spy Ring, and we have at least a copy of it on hand, if not the original. Because that's one of the interesting things, too, is it's unfortunate to see, there's always this new flood of books coming out about the Culper Spy Ring, but often people don't utilize the same sources. So one author may find one source that's incredibly valuable, and then another one may never see that original source and say, one good example is Anna Nancy Strong, clearly part of the Culper Spy Ring. There is a letter from Caleb Brewster that mentions her specifically. And, it's in John Nagee's book, and I'll give him a ton of credit because, he just humbly mentions it and doesn't think anything of it. It's in his book, Invisible Ink. But it's when you look at that, and then you see, other books being like, well, I'm not sure that Anna Nancy Strong is part of the Culper Spy Ring. And it's like, it's just a shame that there's, that we don't have a repository where people can start these books and just say, here's every primary source. You tell the story. Mm-hmm, right. And that's one of the things that I love about the way we set up the museum here, too, is we're not making interpretations for you. We're showing you the original primary source documents so you can make the interpretations. That's, for me, is the best way to go. I love seeing things in people's original voices. To me, it's incredible to, I'm sitting here reading a letter from Caleb Brewster to Governor George Clinton about the privateering. That to me is exciting. And you can have historians tell you what to think, but we definitely recommend you just think for yourself.
Well, this has been great, and it's a far-ranging conversation, but this is the kind of passion we want to try to instill in other people. Again, we want to thank you for the time. on this rainy afternoon. It's probably a bad day to be in Drowned Meadow when it's raining this much. But good luck with the cottage, the launch or the opening, or getting more people. It sounds like you're going to be a valuable addition to the whole Culper landscape here. So congratulations and good luck, and thanks for talking.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you again to Mark. Always great to talk more about the Culper Spy Ring. Always more to learn. And Mark left us with a great reading list. We will link to that in our show notes. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org, including ways to find the Drowned Cottage and their social media. Keep an eye on them as they ramp up and start doing more great things in the community. Unfortunately, I don't think Turn is streaming anywhere easily accessible, but hopefully you've seen it, or at some point you'll be able to check out Turn Washington Spies. And if you are a fan of the Culper Spy Ring, if you are part of the Turn family, if you like this episode, all we ask is that you share it with a friend, send it in an email, post it on Facebook, mention it to the people sitting in the service lounge with you at Sunrise Toyota. Let them know that there is a podcast out there dedicated to Long Island history. That does it for today's episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.